Hi folks, it's Sammy Osmond here from the Climate Action Reserve. Just like to welcome you all to our second public comment meeting for the Soil Enrichment Protocol development process. We'll just pause for a couple of minutes to let folks log in, and then we'll kick things off in a couple of minutes' time. So thanks for joining us. Alrighty, I think we can get going now. It's Sammy Osmond here at the Climate Action Reserve. So welcome folks. This is our second public comment meeting for our Soil Enrichment Protocol development process. So very happy to have you joining us. Looks like there's a good number of you online already. So let's get going. A little bit by way of housekeeping first. All attendees will be in listen-only mode through the duration of the webinar today. We will be happy to take questions throughout the session. So you'll see there's a little user interface. It's usually in the top right-hand corner of the screen. Let me pull mine out. And you'll see on mine, it's the third row from the bottom. There's a question function. So if you click on that, you should be able to type questions in. So we will have a number of staff that will get to say a little quick hello to you in a moment. They'll be there checking out the question boxes. So there's a good chance they'll be responding to all of your questions shortly after you post them. But if we need to, we can also follow up via email to answer questions that aren't addressed during the meeting itself. And then, as we always do, a copy of the slides, as well as a recording of the presentation, will be posted online, usually pretty quickly after the webinar. Let's keep moving. By way of agenda today, as I mentioned, first we'll go through introductions. What we'll do is show you a slide where we list all of the workgroup members. We won't ask them to say hello because there's a very, very good number of them. And also, this is a public comment webinar. Hang on, let me just check. Looks like I'm getting a note. Yeah, no worries. Sorry, just checking, make sure there isn't any technical difficulties. Where was I? Introductions. We'll say a quick hello. We'll show you who the workgroup members are again, and a big thanks to all of those. Very generous for them to have donated so much time for this effort. And then we'll move on to staff. So I will invite the staff that are on the call to say a quick hello, just to make sure you know who's here. From there, we'll give a quick overview of the process, just remind you where this webinar fits into the overall development effort. And then we'll move on to the substantive content for the meeting today, the protocol overview. And then from that, we'll circle back a little bit more by way of the process, remind you again what the key next steps are. And then right at the last slide, I think we typically provide contact details. Okay, let's go to introductions. So Craig Ebert is the Climate Action Reserve President. He's actually out at the moment. Let me check quickly to see if he's in by any chance. No, he's not. Okay, so he's off dropping his youngest child at college, so he won't be joining us today. But second name there, Sammy Osmond, that's me. So you'll have my contact details at the end. If you are not familiar with me already, you'll have the details there, and you can feel free to reach out anytime if you'd like to talk things through with me. And then the rest of the team. Would you like to say a quick hello, Heather?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Raven, Senior Project Coordinator. I've been helping coordinate the whole process for protocol development. So we look forward to any other questions or comments you might have.
Thanks, Heather. And John, would you like to say a quick hello?
Yeah, hi everyone. This is John Rumacall. I'm a Senior Manager at the Reserve. I've been supporting the development of the protocol, and I just wanted to thank you all for tuning in today, and I look forward to getting your feedback on the current draft of the protocol. Thanks.
Thanks, John. And Sarah, would you like to say a quick hello?
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Westcott. I'm a Senior Manager at the Reserve and have also been helping with protocol drafting and development. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Sarah. And Betty, would you like to say a quick hello?
Sure. Hi, good morning, everyone. I've been supporting the development of the performance standard test, and I look forward to your feedback. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Betty. And here we have the list of all the workgroup members. So again, we're very, very grateful for all the very generous support from each of these folks. This is a voluntary process, so all of these folks here have been absolutely instrumental in helping provide technical feedback on various parts of the protocol. So thanks again to everybody. All right, let's get into process overview. So you'll see here, we had a scoping meeting back in January of 2020. We actually had a public scoping meeting the year prior, towards the end of the year, where we sort of got together with a number of experts to talk things through. But formally, we kicked this process off in January. From there, after that first meeting, we formed our work group. And you can see there we had a number of work group meetings. There were also some subgroups that met on specific topics, which aren't listed there, but a good number of meetings. And then the public comment process. So I think a lot of your names are familiar, so you'll know that we had a public comment period already, full month, starting back in April, had a public comment meeting. And then we got a really good level of feedback, which was very, very useful. So we'll summarize that in a moment. But as a result of that, we circled back for the fourth workgroup meeting there. And then today we're coming back to you with a second public comment meeting in the middle of our second public comment period. So in red there, it means it's very important. You'll note the last date there, August 25th. So we'll remind you a little bit later when we circle back with next steps. But in essence, if anybody is interested in providing further formal written feedback, we would invite you to do so by close of day, August 25th, which is next Tuesday. And then just by way of reminder, whenever anybody submits formal public comments in writing, we always respond in writing as well. And both the public comments and our responses are published online. So if you're interested, you can go to our webpage where the soil enrichment details are posted, and you'll have a chance to look at a lot of the materials, including the previous public comments and our responses. Then from there, all things go well. At the end of each project protocol development process, we present our protocols to our board. So it's actually our board that adopts those. So the next available opportunity we have to do that is September 30th. So we'll work towards that deadline, but that's obviously still TBD, depending on what transpires between now and then. Okay, so this is a little bit of an overview of the previous public comment process. So you'll see here we got extensive feedback during the first public comment period. So thank you again for everybody who contributed towards that effort. We got 23 formal sets of public comments. We also got a lot of informal feedback via email and calls. So again, you're all very much welcome to provide formal written comments. Those will be published, etc. But you're also very welcome to just reach out to us if you want to organize a call, or if you want to just exchange, materials via email, etc., without necessarily having those posted online and having us respond formally. Very much welcome both of those. As a result of that feedback, we engaged in extensive further deliberations, both within the workgroup members as well as public commenters. Some of those are ongoing, so thanks again for that. And we had we were lucky to have follow-up discussions with most of those public commenters, which were also very useful. As a result of all that great feedback, we've made extensive changes throughout the protocol and also the supporting documents. So during this webinar here, we'll highlight some of those key changes in red throughout. So this last dot point is an example where red is used not to highlight a key change, but yeah, I think that's pretty straightforward. Public comments due by end of day Tuesday, August 25th. Okay, let's get into the substantive materials. So, excuse me, this layout here is essentially how all of our protocols are laid out. So once you're familiar with those, you'll get a sense of where you want to go to find the relevant information you're looking for. And so on the webinar today, we'll basically go through in order and sort of highlight some of the key parts of the protocol, and then also hone in where you'll see some of the changes that we've made in response to all of the really robust feedback that we've received. So let's start off with a project definition. Right at the start of our protocols, we go into a fair bit of detail to really help folks understand what it is that we're talking about here. So for this project type, really we're talking about cropland or grassland. And we put in a little few safeguards there to make sure we're not experiencing, significant land use change, like people cutting down virgin forests and that sort of thing. So there's a few stipulations in there. First of all, must not have been cleared. So no clearing of native ecosystems. And then, we got feedback to help us expand that a little bit further to also talk about restored or other protected areas within the last 10 years. So basically, we're looking at cropping or grassland that's been stable in that state for 10 years, and then they come into the project and adopt new practices. So we should not expect any significant land use change as a result of this projects developed under this protocol. We also expanded another little eligibility criteria there. So you'll see there's a little bit of language in the protocol around tile drained fields. We expanded that a little bit to include surface drainage with some caveats there. So if it was pre-existing, then that should be fine. In order to develop a project, one must adopt one or more new practices. And we've indicated the types of changes that are likely to be, generating significant emission reductions. So there will be changes to things like fertilizer applications. We had some good feedback to help us, specify clearly that will definitely include things like biosolids, possibly also other amendments such as compost. So if anybody's making significant changes with respect to how they apply any of those things, then that's will be eligible and quite likely will result in some good emission reductions. We also mentioned water management and irrigation. A couple of other points there. Evapotranspiration should be covered by models, so we'll get into modeling a little bit later. And then also another note from some great feedback we received that where irrigation increases in the project scenario, we'll also need to account for any significant increases in nitrogen from water sources. So we're going to do a little bit of work to try to identify which water sources around the country are likely to trigger that, and then provide clear guidance to verifiers. So we won't be saying that folks need to go out there and do their own studies. We'll do that and try to provide clear guidance to help folks know when that particular point is going to be relevant for their fields or projects. A couple of other major project activity types there that we expect to see: changes in tillage or residue management, crop planting and harvesting. So obviously there'll be some opportunities with respect to cover crops in particular, but there might also be substantive changes in terms of crop rotations. So we'll capture those, and those could be eligible. Fossil fuel usage and grazing practices and emissions. Just pause for a moment real quickly. With respect to ownership and aggregation, what we've done in this protocol is essentially decouple greenhouse gas rights from land rights. What we mean by that is we've tried to simplify things, and we assume that the grower who's undertaking these activities owns the greenhouse gas rights. So the grower owns the offsets unless they contractually transfer to an aggregator or other party. So we don't require the grower to produce a deed or a title to the property. However, we are actively encouraging folks to ensure that if the grower is renting, for instance, that they make sure that the landholder is fully informed about the offset project and has contractually consented. That would be the ideal scenario, so we minimise risk for the project and the reserve, but that's not going to be strictly required. A single aggregator would own all greenhouse gas rights for any field within a project, meaning that a project would have a single point of ownership. So for this type of project, as is probably going to be common for agricultural-based offsets, is we expect there to be single parties bringing together many fields, many farmers under what we call an aggregation model in order to have more cost-effective, larger projects. So under this protocol, there'll be no limit on the number of fields or combinations of crop regional practice in an aggregated project. And CRTs, which is what we call our offsets, will be issued to the aggregated project as a whole and not differentiated by field. So additionality is a core concept within offset programs. And in this particular protocol, we have a number of mechanisms, or within all our programs, a number of mechanisms contribute to additionality screening. First of all, practices must not be legally mandated, so we have a legal additionality test. Growers must implement at least one new practice change, so existing practices will actually be accounted for as part of the project's baseline. And when growers adopt sustainable practices one at a time, so we cannot scale to many growers doing multiple practices if we don't start with growers adopting one new practice. Then we have, you can see here in red, we've also added a new layer of additionality screening based on substandard feedback that we've received during the public comment process, the first one. So again, thanks for folks for contributing in that form. So what we've also added is a negative list performance standard test. Basically, we've gone in and assessed available data on common practice to see what is already happening around the country in terms of those types of changes that we mentioned to be activity practice changes that we expect. And based on that data, we found, county level data, we were able to determine the rates of uptake of those types of practices at a county level across the United States. And so we've created a negative list, which basically identifies all the counties around the country for which the uptake rate of a given practice the uptake rate of given practice. And then from there, we've created a threshold. We say where uptake rate is 50% or above of such a practice in the given county, it will be excluded by default. So we'll go through on the next slide what some of those results, summary results, look like. Give you a sense of what the impact of that will be. Then we also provide project-specific means, so if to demonstrate additionality for excluded fields. So it's essentially a two-step process. First of all, you go through and see if any of your fields are in areas where that specific practice, assuming it's a single practice that's adopted, is going to be excluded because it's on the negative list. But then projects are given a chance to take some or all of those fields off the negative list, and we've given a couple of mechanisms to do that. The first of those is if any of those identified fields stack further new practices within a short window of time, within 3 years. Essentially, we've got agronomic guidance to suggest that, first of all, the fourth dot point above, growers are very likely to dip their toe in the water with one new change at a time. So really we want to encourage that as best as we can. However, if one of those, the single practice that a farmer adopts is on this negative list, they then have a 3-year window to start to add on more practices. We're trying to essentially promote movement towards a whole new sustainable system of farming, but we need to do it in a time frame that doesn't put the farmer at too much risk of significant changes that risks their yield and whatnot. So we give a window of 3 years there for a farmer to adopt a second eligible practice to be able to take any excluded fields off that negative list. The last dot point there's a second mechanism that projects could use to take any of their excluded fields off the list, and that's to demonstrate that the adoption of long-term no-till is not common practice in those given counties. There is some evidence in the literature and also coming from the USDA, which suggests that although there might be significant uptake of no-till in some areas, we see that a lot of those folks are actually still rotating no-till every couple of years with tillage practices. So it's not long-term no-till. So we think in those circumstances, a project under this protocol that adopts long-term no-till, where all of their peers in their immediate environment are doing no-till but rotating it, then there will be the potential for additional soil carbon gains within the project. Looks like we're getting some questions in. Yeah, this is a fairly heady subject matter, so definitely feel free to pepper our friends here with all your tricky questions. So what does this common practice assessment look like? What do the results look like? Here we summarize it quite simply. There's going to be 57 counties where reduced tillage will be excluded if adopted as a single practice. And there's going to be 290 counties where no-till will be excluded. 2 counties where cover crops are quite prevalent. And then 9 counties where rotation or intensive grazing is going to be ineligible as a single practice for a project. So we have an Excel-based tool where you can just go through and see all of those results. You can filter as you need and hone in on which counties you're interested in and get a good, clear sense of what the implications of this test will be. That tool was made available some time ago, so I think it's hopefully still up on our website. If not, you can reach out to us if you'd like to get a copy. We'll move on to the start date and crediting period. So for all our protocols, we essentially say when you first implement this new practice, whatever it is, we went through the project definition at the start. From that point forward, we consider that the start date of the project. So for this particular protocol, it's a little bit more complicated than usual because we're talking about, complex farming systems. So what we say is that start date is the initiation of the growing season within which the initial practice change occurred. It's a little bit more complicated. So what we say is it's typically the day after the final harvest or termination of the previous growing season. And it's going to be defined separately for each field within a given project. Then the crediting period is basically the entire period over which the project is eligible to be issued credits. We call that a crediting period in our program. So for this protocol, the crediting period is set at 10 years for each field, with the potential to renew 2 times for a total of 30 years. This is highlighted in red because previous versions of the protocol, we just put out a flat 30-year crediting period, but we've got some really useful feedback, which has helped us sort of redefine that. So the current crediting period, each field would be able to get credits for up to 10 years. And then if they'd like, they can come back at the end of that period and apply for a renewed crediting period, another 10 years. And at that point, they would be required to meet the eligibility requirements again. And if they do, they can keep going. Cultivation cycle, so all growing seasons within approximately 12 months. Initial reporting period may include multiple cultivation cycles. And then the verification period, which is the time period for which projects must hire an independent third-party verifier, may include multiple reporting periods. In essence, what we're saying here is that we're going to have data and reports, information coming to us, broken down into these cultivation cycles, so they'll match when the new crop was rolled out over the field right through to the end of when that's finally harvested. But we then create a fair bit of flexibility in terms of how often projects must provide that information to us and how frequently they can ask for credits in return. Rationale behind that is sometimes it might be more cost effective for a given project to delay and essentially put together a number of years before they then go out and hire a verifier to verify that group of years together. For some, that might be more cost effective. So we've provided flexibility there for that, which is relatively typical across our program and other offset programs. Permanence. Next, we'll talk a little bit about permanence. So in this project type, there's likely to be two main categories where offsets could be issued. One is where there's sequestration, where CO2 is pulled out of the atmosphere and it's stored in the soils themselves. As the name of the protocol suggests, we expect that to be one of, if not the largest, opportunity for offset generation. So, and then the other opportunity is where there's a reduction in trace gases, essentially. So whenever there is offsets issued with respect to sequestration, so the storage of CO2 in either soils in this case, or in trees if you're in a forest protocol, we need to ensure that that carbon is then stored for a significant period of time. It's 100 years in essence. And then when we refer to permanence, that's basically ensuring that any offsets issued with respect to sequestration soil carbon are secured for that 100-year period. So we assess permanence at the project level. So risk and liability are placed on the aggregator rather than the grower. So the grower themselves wouldn't be required to sort of make good on any problems that came up. It would be the project as a whole that would do that. We typically use buffer pool contributions for what we call unavoidable reversals. In essence, if there's something like a natural disaster or some conditions that occur that were outside the control of the farmer or the project, then these buffer pool contributions will be used to replace those soil carbon losses. So for this protocol, we require all projects to contribute to the buffer pool in amounts that range from 5 to 16.8%. Unavoidable reversals include a 7.5% contribution or 5% if a project is geographically dispersed. We got some good feedback which helped us craft an exception so that, an exception to the 7.5% requirement for smaller projects. So this basically means if you have a very large project that's very concentrated in a given area, then there might be a little bit more risk that if a big impact event comes through, then we might see substantive losses. Whereas if you had a same very large project spread out over a very large geographic area, then there's perhaps a little bit less risk that we would see some sort of a catastrophic failure. And then with respect to smaller projects, feedback sort of pointing out that it could be a little bit more difficult for small projects to meet that extra requirement for a buffer pool contribution if they were concentrated. So we think that that's probably reasonable to keep it at the lower level contribution there, noting that we expect larger projects to be the norm. And so if there are, a small number of smaller projects, then the risk to the program as a whole is probably manageable. So lower contribution is probably a sufficient level of risk that we can manage. There's also a contribution with respect to risk of financial failure. It's set at either 0 or 9%, depending on a number of factors which are listed in the protocol. And then total risk is mitigated through the use of a guarantor or financial protection. There's an option there that the parties could enter some other types of financial arrangements to provide additional assurance that in the event of a large-scale reversal, that there'll be some mechanism in there to pay that back so that they wouldn't have to. Avoidable reversals are compensated by the project developer. So I gave you a little bit of information on what a unavoidable reversal is. So an avoidable reversal is something where it's the project proponents themselves that have done something deliberately to result in soil carbon being released to the atmosphere. So probably a useful example might be tillage. Let's say a number of fields have been engaging in no-till, and we assess that there's an increase in soil carbon. If one or more of those folks decide that, you know, for whatever reason they want to till in a certain year, then that might result in some reversal or release of that soil carbon. So in that type of scenario, it would be the project itself that would have to compensate, and the compensation wouldn't come out of the buffer pool. We require a legal commitment to this 100-year period, and that's usually enshrined in what we call a project implementation agreement. It's essentially a contract where the project developer, the aggregator, agrees to essentially abide by all of these requirements in the protocol. We also allow for what's called a ton-year accounting option. So it's not mandatory, but it's optional. And under that type of a mechanism, we would only credit the atmospheric benefit for the term of the PIA. So what this basically means, I'll use a very crude example where the math won't be precise. But if you were to say, I don't want to do a 50-year PIA, not interested in that, I want to do, sorry, a 100-year, I'd prefer to do a 50-year, then in essence, you would only end up getting around 50% the total offsets that you would get if you'd gone for the 100-year option. If a PIA term is less than 100 years after crediting and ton-ton accounting is used, so if this ton-year approach is not used and you don't want to sign a PIA for 100 years, then that's fine too, and you would have a couple of options. One, at the end of the, whatever it is, the term of the PIA that you're comfortable with, you would either extend it. In other words, if you're comfortable with a 10-year commitment, then you could have rolling further commitments. Or at the end of that period, we would declare all of the soil carbon to have been reversed that wasn't accounted for in that first 10 years. We did also have some flexible options there, alternative mechanisms to demonstrate permanence. There were some options there with respect to looking at the rates that farmers might move back to different practices after adopting sustainable practices. We also looked at things like using remote sensing. We received a lot of feedback that those are not appropriate. So in response to that feedback, we've essentially removed those alternative mechanisms to demonstrate permanence. So again, we really appreciate all the robust feedback we received. It's been quite useful to help us refine these requirements. So GHG assessment boundary sounds quite a little bit dry, should we say? So this is basically just a very high level summary of where the main GHG impacts are likely to be. So by SSR, we mean source, sink, or reservoir. So as I mentioned before, soil organic carbon is going to be one of the best opportunities here to develop offsets. So that's included within the boundary. And there's a number of others there. Methane, fertilizer use, nitrogen fixing crops is likely to be a popular option. We capture any impacts with respect to manure deposition. So if somebody's bringing manure into the project, they must account for all of the N2O and CH4 associated with that. That would contribute towards less offsets issued because we have to recognise those impacts. Also enteric fermentation, fossil fuel usage. So if there's any significant changes in fossil fuel usage, which we don't necessarily anticipate, if there was, that would have to be captured and accounted for. And then we also have accounting for biomass burning, if there's any changes driven by the project with respect to biomass burning. And then a number of other opportunities were not included. We did have some decent level of interest there, but you'll see most of those relate to forestry related activities, woody biomass in essence. So for this particular protocol, we've tried to simplify and stick to cropping and grazing, generally speaking, but we'll certainly be open to looking at those further types of opportunities in future. Now we'll get into an overview of the quantification approach in this protocol. So in essence, in this protocol, we're using a hybrid of modeling and direct measurement. For setting the baseline, initial soil carbon, that's what we mean by SOC, is directly measured. So at the start of the project, direct measurements of soil carbon must be taken. In other words, somebody must go out there with a shovel, dig up a bunch of dirt, and then it needs to be sent to a lab and tested. From there, the historical baseline period is used to set the crop and management activities that defines the baseline. So basically, whatever was happening prior to that introduction of the new activity, that's going to be the baseline, and then it's only we're only going to issue offsets for greenhouse gas impacts or changes where the project moves away from those historic activities. Baseline soil carbon is then modelled for each reporting period. So every year, roughly, going forward, you'll have to remodel using reporting period weather data. So that was some very useful feedback we received early on. In other words, we really want to make sure we account for anything like climate change related impacts or climatic changes. So for that reason, when we're remodeling the baseline for each new year, we'll be using contemporary weather data. In terms of the reporting period, project soil carbon can be modelled or directly measured. That third dot point there, at least every 5 years, you must directly measure your soil carbon. So again, the soil carbon will be measured at the start of the project, and then at least every 5 years thereafter, it will have to be remeasured. Some folks might like to do it more frequently, and we do expect in the future that the technological and scientific advances could make it so that it's much more cost effective to directly measure soil carbon. So quite possibly in the future, we'll see it being used more frequently. But at present, we allow for soil carbon to be modelled or directly measured in the reporting period. And then projects may employ a mix of modelling, measurement, and also default equations and emission factors. So in a following slide, we'll give you a little summary of which of those sources, sinks and reservoirs can use either of these three approaches. Separate quantification of reversible and non-reversible emission reductions will be undertaken. In other words, anything related to sequestration will be quantified separately, and anything related to reductions of trace gases will be quantified separately and then summed together. Comprehensive quantification of uncertainty will also be required, with a deduction applied to reversible and non-reversible emission reductions. So the uncertainty deduction will be applied to all the offsets that have been quantified. Quantification overview. So a lot of equations in this one. So we've got 2 equation maps, a little bit fancy. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but these are basically sort of giving you a map of how the respective equations fit in and how we work our way up to a quantification of the total GHG impacts for each given year at the end. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you'll see we've got a good number of equations there. So a lot of default equations for some of those trace gases in essence. Reversible versus non-reversible emission reductions. So we touched on this when we were going through the permanence slide. So the goal is to have these issued, these issues separately in the registry. So we should be able to help delineate between offsets associated with sequestration and others. There might be, I think, emerging elements in the marketplace that would desire us to be able to delineate between the two. So that's something that we're going to work towards within our registry system. So reversible emission reductions will be the soil carbon stock increases and also be the source of buffer pool contributions. And the non-reversible emission reductions, so that's all of the trace gases like nitrous oxide and methane and CO2. Those will be resulting from changes in fertilizer usage, grazing, use of nitrogen fixing species, biomass burning, and fossil fuel combustion. And then the uncertainty deduction, as we mentioned, is applied across both of those categories. Here is that table I mentioned. We've got a simple overview of those key sources of GHG impacts and whether this protocol allows for them to be modeled, directly measured, or calculated. In some instances, a number of options are available. So how do we define the baseline? In this protocol, it's fairly complex, which is, reflects the complex farming systems that we have. In essence, what we need is to determine the length of what's a reasonable historical baseline period. So for this protocol, we set it at a minimum of 3 years prior to the start date. We do encourage folks to have as many years as they feel comfortable with, so that the modeling will become more and more robust with the more data that's available. But it's an absolute minimum of 3 years of data must be provided to set the baseline. Additional years can be included, so the baseline period contains a full rotation of crops and management practices. So we'll have a few little diagrams in a moment that sort of illustrates it. But if you were moving, let's say, a crop rotation and something like a tillage activity, then we would hope the baseline, we would need the baseline period to reflect whatever that rotation of crops and activities were. This example here, okay, so we've got a corn soy rotation. The baseline period should be 4 years, meeting the 3-year minimum requirement, keeping the complete rotations. I think that's actually an error. I think it would be corn soy rotation if it's just one corn and one soy. Actually, sorry, that is right. So we need a 3-year minimum. So therefore we would take it to the 4 years. That makes sense. If it was a three crop rotation, then you would only be absolutely necessary to have 1 year of each of those crops for your minimum of 3 years. Sorry, a little bit of slip up there on my part. I might just pause to get a quick drink. Give me 1 second. Okay, so in essence, there'll be 2 options for baseline modeling. So we'll give you a little diagram on the next page, which will hopefully make it a little bit more comprehensible. But in essence, there will be an option to use a matched baseline or a blended baseline. So the matched baseline, as the name suggests, is where during the project reporting period or the crediting period, let's say you're rotating crops, it would match the same rotation that you used in your historic baseline. So if you're doing corn, soy, corn, soy, corn, soy, in your prior to starting the project, and you kept doing corn, soy, corn, soy, corn, soy, then you would be able to use the matched baseline. Whenever you're doing a corn season in your project, you would compare it to your corn season in your baseline. Let's see. Average results. If multiple years the same crop and baseline, the average results of the 2 separate continuous model runs. So on the next page, we'll give a better understanding of what that means. And then the alternative is the blended baseline. So where the project scenario crop doesn't match the baseline crop pattern, the baseline is a blend of each year of the historical baseline period. Includes the entire historical baseline period with separate continuous model runs for each year with the results averaged together. So the little visual that we have on the next slide should make it a little bit easier to conceptualize, but it is relatively complex, so please do feel free to reach out if you want us to talk it through. So this blended baseline can be used at the start by any project if they choose to. So this is optional unless you have to use it because you've changed your crop rotation. So it is foreseeable that cropping patterns will diverge from baseline rotations at some point during the crediting period, right? We're talking about a 10-year period. Quite possibly there'll be a change at which point the field would need to start using the blended baseline approach. So yeah, the little diagram here will hopefully help articulate what I mentioned earlier. So the matched baseline is fairly simple. Let's start with that one. You've got your red crop, green, blue, black, yellow, and then that pattern is maintained. So in essence, each time you have a red, you'll be comparing it to your red. Each time you have a green, compare it to a green, etc. Now the blended baseline approach, you can see what we'll do is continue to model separate streams all the way through for that 10 or 30-year period. And then as soon as the project chooses to or needs to use the blended approach, in that first year, they'll in essence be creating an average of the results from all of those different colors together, and that will be used as the baseline value for that given year. Let's see, so this applies to soil carbon, N2O, and also methane. The same approach would be employed in any given reporting period for which somebody chooses to use the default equations. So In other words, if you're using the blended approach, but you want to use some of the equations in a given reporting period, and you follow that same process where you grab together the data for each of those different baseline periods and you blend those together into an average result, and that would be used for that given reporting period for that given equation input. So we have gone through several iterations of how to set the baseline through extensive discussions with workgroup members and others. So this approach has been in place for some time now, but certainly feel free to reach out if you'd like to talk it through. But I'm going to keep moving. Default equations. So what do we have? So as we mentioned, modeling is needed for soil carbon stock change and methane coming off soil. But other than that, for all the other source gases, the protocol does offer default equations derived from a couple of sources. One is our grassland protocol, which we put together a few years ago, and that has some useful equations for methane emissions from livestock, from manure and enteric sources. And then for everything else, we have IPCC guidelines. So a good number of those you'll know are reflected in the USDA's Blue Book equations, except for one, which we're continuing to study to see if we swap that over. But in essence, we're using US EPA equations / IPCC defaults as optional means to quantify the impacts with respect to a number of these activities. So that'll be for things like fertilizer usage, crop residues, incorporated crop residues, and also any burning that goes on. Okay, quick time check. With respect to uncertainty, there's a number of different pools of uncertainty that will be required to be combined into a single uncertainty discount that will be applied to all offsets, whether they are sequestration or trace gas reductions. So we'll have sample error as well as model structural uncertainty. So this is an approach which is more robust than what we've seen in available protocols. So we think it's going to be, fairly challenging to implement, but fairly robust. So we feel it's a pretty reasonable approach. And then the uncertainty deduction will be applied if the total uncertainty exceeds 15% of the 95 confidence interval. So it'll be a design-based approach with flexibility in terms of a lot of the choices, in terms of sample units, how to stratify. We'll get into that in a lot more detail when we get to look at soil sampling requirements. And then there's an appendix that's dedicated to this uncertainty requirements. So I have to warn you, it is fairly complex. And we also have an Excel-based tool which should help automate a lot of the calculations. So you input your information into the tool and it'll run those equations in the background and produce a result. So that'll hopefully help simplify and streamline your accounting for uncertainty. Leakage, we also have mechanisms in place to deal with leakage. So just briefly, what do we mean by leakage? So basically, this is a concept whereby if there's a reduction in productive output, so in our case, probably crop yields or livestock raising, that reduced supply could emerge outside of the project area and therefore could increase emissions outside of the project area. So it's essentially activity shifting from the project outside of the project because of the project. If that's to happen, then there's a risk that that activity is simply popping up elsewhere and there's emissions elsewhere, so we need to account for that. So as a result of that, we treat reduced production as a source of emissions. So we treat it as if a fait accompli, that production has popped up somewhere else, and we essentially require projects to account for that as if it was a source of emissions. Quick note that we normalise those assessments of productive changes, productive output based on regional conditions. In other words, we want to make sure that if there's a drop in output, it's not a result of something like climatic changes for the whole region. So we normalise that data based on the regional data in essence. So there'll be field and project level, both field and project level declines in output will be accounted for, and then as we mentioned, there'll be a deduction for the overall credit issuance. So a little bit more detail with respect to cropping. What we've done is we've found what we think is a very useful, robust data set that we can use to assess changes in productive output for cropping, so changes in yield, in essence. So the approach we've put together uses crop insurance data from the USDA. We require that folks use as disaggregated as available data from the data set as possible. And such some of the reasons why we think this is a pretty good data set to use is that it's transparent, verifiable, and there's also a very strong incentive for farmers not to game that data because it could have significant implications in terms of their insurance coverage. So just a quick note, we are not expecting to see significant leakage throughout the crediting period. We were advised that we could see some yield declines as farmers move away from food and trusted systems to slowly adopt new practices. There could be a little bit of a yield decline as they're adjusting and as the soil and the biogeochemical system is adjusting. But even over that 10-year first crediting period, we should expect to see that yield will stabilize and hopefully increase over time. So in those circumstances, there might be a little bit of perhaps some leakage at the start, but it should taper off and normalize, and we should see increased yields as those systems are starting to be employed effectively and working well. And then in terms of grazing, so in terms of leakage for livestock grazing, we use a mechanism, first of all, to account for grazing that looks at both animal population and time spent grazing. We call it animal grazing days, which is similar to animal unit months. And in essence, we use that same approach for accounting for leakage. So basically, we look closely at the data for both how many animals and how long they were put on this property to graze. If there's a significant drop, then we treat that as leakage. So we just compare the baseline levels of those data inputs to the reporting period levels. Significant drops will be treated as a requirement to make that leakage deduction. Monitoring. So we've got extensive guidance in the protocol for monitoring, tries to hone in on all of the critical monitoring for all of the different changes that we're seeing in the project. We did revise quite a bit of that feedback that guidance based on very useful feedback from both the work group process and the public comment process. So thanks again for that. Not a lot of that is summarized here because it's just not necessarily easy to summarize in a couple of dot points, but some very useful feedback there. So some of the key elements that we're going to be monitoring for, basically monitoring for land use change. So that's going to be most useful for things like soil carbon. If we are adopting new practices which help build soil carbon, then a change away from those new practices could be a very useful, simple indicator that there's perhaps a risk there that some of that built up soil carbon is potentially going to be released. So looking for land use change is probably one of the easiest ways we can detect risk. And if we see such risk, we then have mechanisms to go in and account for it. So in that context, the use of remote sensing could be quite useful, could be a cost-effective means to sort of say, okay, looks like there's been no till for a few years, but now we can see that this field's been tilled, so we need to go in and make sure that we account for that. We also have guidance and requirements for monitoring for project emissions. So a lot of data will be collected directly from each grower. And then we also have prospective project developers talking about the use of machine data, remote sensing where available and reliable. So again, we hope that as technological advances are brought forward, that project developers are able to employ those in a number of areas to help make projects more feasible. So we've built this protocol to be able to accommodate for as much of that as possible. In terms of permanence, there's a lot of good guidance there for both the crediting period, so what monitoring requirements are needed while credits are still being issued, and then there's also separate guidance where relevant for what monitoring requirements need to be kept in place for that 100 years after that given field is no longer getting credits. So you'll see that in the protocol. That'll again will be assessing land use change, will be one of the most useful indicators. And there might be, it might be relevant to employ remote sensing in that context as well. There's also additional guidance specifically for soil sampling testing and also for modelling. So we'll go through those in a little bit more detail on some further slides. Again, just to be clear, remote sensing will be used potentially to detect practice change, but not to quantify the GHG impacts of such changes. Let's look at a very high-level overview of the soil sampling guidance. There's quite a bit of guidance in there, so if you're interested, I recommend you go and take a good close look at it. But that includes guidance for all of the simple issues listed here, so sample units, how to actually delineate sample units, as well as stratification approach, site location, site preparation, sample depth. So with respect to sample depth, we had a good level of feedback with respect to the depth of sample in particular. So this protocol sets a minimum sample depth of 30 centimeters. Key reason for that is that currently models are really working well using soil samples to a depth of 30 centimeters, but not deeper than that. We do know that there's work underway to make a lot of the currently available best by geochemical models and other models to be able to model to depths deeper than that. So as soon as those are ready, we will revisit this notion of a minimal sample depth, but for now we set it at 30 centimeters. We do encourage deeper samples to be taken. And we also have some guidance in there that makes it clear that if folks take deeper samples, there is an incentive built in that you can then have that data verified and stored. And if and when models are capable of modeling to deeper depths, you could come back and potentially get offsets issued for those deeper depth increments. So there's a clear incentive created for deeper samples at this point. We did have some feedback that there were concerns raised that in specific scenarios, there might be migration of soil carbon from deeper layers up into the top 30 centimeters. So in those circumstances, if you're only sampling to 30 centimeters, then it's a little bit of a concern that we might be seeing drops in soil carbon in depths below that. So in order to address that, we focus in on deep tillage. The scenario from the studies we reviewed suggests that moving from deep tillage to no-till is where some of these studies have observed that type of soil migration. So what we've done is put guidance in the protocol that says that if any deep tillage practices were implemented in the baseline period, then those specific fields would not be eligible for soil carbon related credits if they're shifting to no-till. So that's specifically to address the concerns with respect to potential migration of soil carbon when moving from deep till to no-till. So I recommend you go take a good close look at that if you're interested, and certainly feel free to reach out and provide any insight. We've had a fair good amount of engagement with folks on the work group and outside with respect to both the underlying issue as well as the measure that we've put in place here to address it. We will be capturing historical plough depth for all our fields, one of the key data inputs that will be captured. So we'll be able to use the actual historical plough depth to understand whether deep tillage was employed in the baseline, and whether this is a risk that results in those fields being unable to claim soil carbon related offsets if moving to no-till. Finally, verification. So there's a lot of good guidance in the protocol with respect to verification, including for specifically to do with soil sampling. And then, as we mentioned, we have the uncertainty requirements. So one of the key inputs there will be sample error. That would be one of the pools of uncertainty that will be captured and could result in a reduction to all offsets issued. Okay, we'll do a quick time check. We're doing pretty well for time, that's good. Soil testing guidance, very high level summary here. So a monitoring plan must provide detail on soil testing procedures that are used. And then we give some guidance as to some minimum requirements there. So some of the lab analysis requirements include proficiency of the lab itself. So we had some good feedback from soil scientists sort of pointing towards best practices. So we've put explicit reference in the protocol to those types of requirements so we can ensure proficiency of the lab itself. Also some good guidance with respect to sample preparation, including a fair bit of feedback from soil scientists both on the work group and outside. So thanks again for those contributions. And then the analysis technique itself. Modeling guidance. So we're talking about modeling. Modeling must be used. So what guidance do we have for modeling? First of all, we have guidance with respect to the model itself. So the model itself must be publicly available, must be free or for a fee, and it must be peer reviewed by a recognized competent organization or an appropriate peer review group. Based on feedback, we were asked to give specific examples of models that would be considered eligible. So we've included that in writing in the protocol. So DNDC and Comet Farm, two examples that are already going to meet those requirements. And quite possibly there'll be others that are emerge or brought to us that would then need to go through that same process where we make sure that they're sufficiently peer reviewed to be considered appropriate for use. Not only must the model itself be fit for purpose, but then we also have model calibration and validation requirements, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the model must be able to support repeating the project model simulations. This includes clear versioning of the model use in the project, stable software support, etc., as well as fully reported sources and values for all the parameters used with the project version of the model. So let's say a project is using DNDC, if a new version comes out, then we would study closely and make sure that version is appropriate for use, and then we would require the latest version to be used, and then we would go in and make sure we had all the available documentation with respect to the newer version of the tool. Let's see, model must be able to incorporate one or more input variables that are monitored ex post. So the protocol itself contains guidance with respect to what's likely to be minimum model requirements, but obviously those will depend on the model that's chosen. And then on the next slide, we'll go through calibration and validation requirements for the model. So not only must the model itself fit these minimum requirements, it must actually be demonstrated that it's able to be used for the specific activities that we want to model. The project developer must provide sufficient evidence to verify, that's what the VB means, to demonstrate that the validation was done appropriately, declare what data sets they used, and then provide a model sensitivity analysis. But we'll touch on that again in the next slide, I believe. So for this protocol, we pulled out the model calibration and validation guidance into a separate document, which has been made publicly available throughout this process as soon as it was ready. So one of the key rationale for that is that we're then able to make sure that that document can be updated per expert guidance as needed. So as the expert consensus changes, then we'll be able to go in and refine that document accordingly. This is a fairly crude summary of what's in that document. If you're interested, I recommend you go and take a good close look at it. But in essence, there'll be the selection of a suitable model, calibration of the model, so there's a good level of guidance for calibration, and then validation of the model. In red there, we're highlighting that part of that process will require an independent third-party assessment validation report, and will also include the need for peer-reviewed publications. There's some detail there about what elements go into validating the model, practice effects, domain, validation data, assessment of bias, and then assessment of model prediction area. Then the project developer employs the model according to all the guidance of the protocol. And then lastly, that process or the results need to be verified. So the project developer must provide a verified with the raw data, copy of the model, model results, digital signatures in certain circumstances, and also a sensitivity analysis for model inputs. So I think we have a little bit more detail on that when we get to the verification slide as well. Reporting periods. So as we mentioned before, we expect these to be roughly 12 months or shorter, depending on what the specific crop is. Each field will have a defined cultivation year. So basically each crop cycle will be described as a cultivation year, and that would be the basis for their reporting period over which offsets are sought. So more or less 12 months with start or end dates that align with the agronomic cycles. So we talked about that a little bit before, to most accurately capture the full growing season. It may include multiple growing seasons in a single cultivation cycle. The initial reporting period, so the first time a project comes to us and asks for offsets, could include multiple cultivation cycles. We typically allow that for a number of reasons, and then verification periods may include multiple reporting periods up to 5. I mentioned that earlier as well. It's fairly typical in our program and others to allow for a little bit of flexibility, so the projects themselves can determine what sort of frequency is most cost effective for them. And just to be clear, each time offsets are sought, a verification will be required. So when we say here that you could essentially defer that and only do it every 5 years or so, that means that offsets wouldn't be issued in the interim period. It's only when the third-party verifier is hired and they do their work that the project would then get the offsets for that whole 5-year period, if that's the period they chose. Verification, let's see. So our approach to verification is driven by risk-based sampling approach. Basically, these verifiers are expert what they do, so we have very clear guidance, but we also defer in a number of key areas to the verifier's expertise. So we stipulate minimum things that must be done, but once the verifier is applying their expertise, if they sense risk, then they are given great leeway to come in and say, well, for this one, we're going to be doing these extra things, and here's the reason why. And that's very often the case every time offsets are sought, backed up by a random sampling approach. So site visits are selected using a combination of risk-based assessment and random sampling. Here we set a minimum of half square root or 2.5%, whichever is higher, of all field managers will have to receive a site visit, selected first using the risk-based assessment. In other words, when the verifier is looking over all the results, they'll identify any that they think present a key risk for whatever reason, and then if that doesn't rise up to half square root or 2.5% of fields, then they'll use random sampling to keep adding fields until they get to those minimum levels, and then that's the number of fields that will get a site visit for that specific reporting period. So we do have a mechanism in place that we would like to try, which is to allow for proxies for site visits or to otherwise supplement verification activities. So the verifier has just gone through this process. Let's say they've identified 100 fields. They might put together a plan and request that for some of those fields that they are going to forego specifically setting foot on the ground themselves because they've been able to pull together this proxy data and they think it sufficiently provides them with the specific information that they were hoping to get on the ground. We've given some examples of what a verifier might think satisfies them in terms of the evidence that they would have wanted when they're themselves walking around the field. So it'll be things like existing government programs that involve third-party reviews. If there was a program the farm's already enrolled in and it has some sort of a verification component, they might ask the project for the reports or the relevant data, and they might study those and say, well, actually, this does a very good job of exactly what I wanted to do. So in this specific instance, I'm going to defer to this combination of proxy data. Some other ideas, leveraging the expertise of trusted third parties who are on the ground or who are in the relevant county. For instance, NRCS offices are prolific throughout the country, so it might be that they're able to lean on those resources. So rather than putting somebody on a plane and flying them out there, you might potentially pull resources in from those existing sources. University extension might be another useful example. trusted independent third parties could provide some of that data that a verifier is very interested in. Remote sensing could also be a very useful source of proxy data, and then any other existing data capture systems and tools. For instance, we know that project developers are going to want to develop systems to capture a bunch of robust data. So that might be things like, a little device that captures time and date stamp photos, video, etc. If a verifier is bombarded with all sorts of evidence to that effect, they might decide, well, I don't need to go to that field. The key 5 things I wanted to do are these, and I've got enough data. Any concept like that would have to be approved by the reserve as well. So this is certainly not to be taken as a given, and not something that would just rubber stamp year after year. If you get it once, you're not going to be guaranteed to get it the next year. Interestingly, in the current pandemic conditions, we're actually seeing a lot of these types of approaches being rolled out, which has been quite useful for us to, look closely at the criteria they've used and also the results. And I think, each of us in our own fields are being invited to sort of test some of those assumptions that, in person is critical. So that's also been a silver lining to current conditions. In terms of verification of modeling, if a project developer uses an expert third-party model operator, such as the developers and hosts of DNDC, then the verifiers themselves will not be mandated to rerun that model, provided they meet a number of requirements. First of all, the model expert would provide the verifier with a sensitivity analysis on the model inputs, and also evidence that the model results have not been adulterated. So digital signatures could be useful there. So this is a very specific, unique set of circumstances that we have identified, which is present. And so we're looking to hopefully turn that to our advantage and make it so that it could be a way to more cost effectively undertake verification activities. So just to recap, if there is an independent trusted third party that's operating the models, then we are not going to mandate that the verifier themselves would go in and get a copy of the raw data, a copy of the model, and themselves run the model and compare it to the results from the project developer. Instead, they can concentrate on sensitivity of data inputs, veracity of data inputs, and concentrate their activities elsewhere. More on verification activities. I think the verifiers on the call hopefully be happy. A couple of slides there for you guys. Key verification activities will include confirmation of eligibility, assessment of soil sampling and the lab testing, assessment of the use of the biogeochemical models, if relevant, assessment of the use of the default factor-based equations if used. Desk review will include a recalculation of a subset of the project data, and we also have the site visit requirement there, requirements that need to be met. In this protocol, we've given quite a comprehensive overview of many specific types of activities that we think verifiers will need to do, provided explicit guidance on that. One of the reasons we did that is we wanted to carefully go through every single type of activity we thought would be useful in particular at a site visit, to give us a very clear sense of whether that unique proxy data substitute for physical site visits could be used. So I recommend you go take a look at the summary of verification activities. That looks like we're at the end. So let me go back through by way of next steps. So what we have in front of us, the remaining process and timeline. As we mentioned, the public comment period is set to end the end of day Tuesday, August the 25th. So again, if you're interested in sending us formal public comments, we will publish those and respond in writing and publish those responses online. But again, you're free to reach out anytime if you prefer, or to engage in informal discussions. We're happy to do that anytime. Have lots of those. We expect more. And then the next available opportunity for us to present this protocol to our board will be September 30th. So we're going to work diligently towards that date. Next steps for you all. If you'd like to engage, please do. Contact details there. I think there's more details on the next page in case you want mine. reach out if you want to set up a discussion. And then, yeah, to work group members, I think it's pretty clear for all those, but work group members are also very welcome to submit formal public comments if they choose, and or keep engaging with us the way they have informally. And then for reserve staff, we will respond to public comments, and then as we did last time, we will be looking to make updates to the protocol as needed based on any of that ongoing feedback that we receive. Key contacts, that's the policy email we had on the previous slide. That's my email there, address there. If you want to reach out and have a chat, please feel free to do so. And that brings us towards the end of the meeting. Let me just do a quick check with staff. Is there anything any other staff want to put in at this point? Otherwise, we can maybe pause for a couple of minutes to see if people want to submit any last questions. Anyone on the team feel the need to jump in at this point? I'll take silence as a no. Okay, well, again, we really appreciate all of you joining us today. Check. Yeah, very good number of you on the webinar today, so that's absolutely fantastic. Again, we'll be posting a copy of these slides as well as a recording of the webinar to our website. Reach out anytime, you've got our contact details. Make sure you, if you want to talk something through, don't be shy, reach out, and we'll certainly look to put as much time into that as we can. So it doesn't look like anybody's raising anything, so I think we can perhaps wrap it up at this point. So thanks again to all our team at the Reserve for joining, and thanks to all of you out there for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Bye.